There once was a zoo that was noted for their great collection of different kinds of animals. They had the widest variety in the world, in fact. But unfortunately, one day their gorilla died. And in order to keep up appearances of having this full range of animals, the zookeeper hired a man to wear a gorilla suit and to fill in for the dead animal. As he tried on the first day, he didn't really know what to do to act like a gorilla. So he moved back and forth, but he could not move very convincingly, and he got too close to one of the walls of the enclosure and tripped and fell into the lion exhibit. Convinced that his life was over, he began to scream at the top of his lungs until, out of nowhere, the lion said to him, "Be quiet, man, or you're going to get us both fired." Things are not always what they seem in our world today. There are many imposters. Simulations abound, and all that glitters is not gold. Things often look one way and then turn out to be another. Clothes don't make the man or the woman. You can't judge a book by its cover, or a car by its paint job, or a college by its ivy, or a building by its facade, or a church by its steeple. Why? Because appearances can be deceiving. So how do we know if something is real? We have to look more closely, peer more deeply, investigate further, peel back the layers, and get under the surface to find what is real. The Epistle of James is all about finding what is real, getting real with God, real with others, real with ourselves. This letter was written to the early followers of Jesus scattered around Jerusalem in what was called the diaspora, and it is laser focused on the pursuit of real worship, real community, real faith. No substitutes will do for James. Scholars believe the letter of James was written with such authority that it was likely penned by the leader of the church in Jerusalem as a word of encouragement to a community of people who are experiencing unbearable suffering and oppression. James understood that the followers of Jesus in his day were living in tumultuous times, and the crisis they were facing would require serious focus and attention to the authentic practice of faith in everyday life. If they were going to remain true and faithful to each other as a community in the midst of persecution, then they would have to be able to stick together and trust one another. So James said, "Be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. Don't be hearers who forget, but doers who act." There's a difference not only between hearing and doing, but hearing and listening. James reminds me of a basketball coach I had growing up. And whenever we would say things like, "Yeah, coach, we hear you," he'd say, "I know you hear me, but are you listening?" Everything I tell you seems to go in one ear and out the other. Listening for the coach implied a change in behavior. There is often a wide gap between our hearing and our doing, or between hearing and listening. And James wanted people to know that closing that gap is the difference between having true religion and worthless faith. James didn't mince words. One of the greatest interpreters of James is the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He famously summarized the book of James by saying, "Purity of heart is to will one thing." Kierkegaard's maxim sounds a lot like Gary Keller's New York Times bestselling book, The One Thing. Keller, in his book, suggests that behind every successful person is their one thing. The ability to dismiss distractions and concentrate on your one thing, he says, is the only obstacle that stands between you and your goals. According to Keller, finding this one thing will help you get extraordinary results in every situation in your life. And so in the book he asks, what's that one thing that you can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? And while Keller might sound like Kierkegaard, that was not what Kierkegaard had in mind. When he was interpreting James, He was not saying that James was interested in results or success. James was not writing a self-help book, offering people strategies to get extraordinary results in every situation. James was interested in helping people live authentic relationships with God and others. For Kierkegaard, purity in James, purity for Kierkegaard, is synonymous with holiness, but not holiness with an H, holiness with a W. He meant that we cannot allow ourselves to be divided between 1,000 different loyalties and 1,000,000 different pursuits. We must have a single undivided focus, one ultimate goal and purpose in life. Purity, for both Kierkegaard and James, is to be wholeheartedly committed to this one thing, which is a lot easier said than done. The truth is, most of us are living incredibly divided lives between work and home and school and family and friends and fitness and community activities and church. We can't even begin to imagine what it might mean to will one thing when our hearts and minds and bodies and lives are scattered in 100 different directions. James might ask us, is there anything holding us together? The language of purity is a reflection of James's first century Jewish context, where purity codes were used to maintain a culture of honor and shame. In our culture today, we don't really use the language of purity, which means we can find it difficult and off-putting when James uses words like pure and perfect and undefiled and unstained, because we think the word perfect means without error or blemish. But in the first century, it meant completeness, fullness, wholeness. We also think the word pure means unmixed or uncontaminated. But for James, it meant something more like consistent, authentic, genuine, real, true. Scholars believe the word pure for James basically means the opposite of hypocrisy. And so the core virtue of life for James then is the virtue of integrity. Integrity is not a word that we hear very much, is it? I wonder why. The word integrity has three meanings in English: the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, the state of being whole or undivided, and the condition of being unified or sound in construction. And for James, the word pure had all of those meanings. It meant honest, moral, whole, undivided, unified, and sound. The spiritual writer Roberta Bondi claims that a sign of maturity in faith is abandoning the idea that purity is the main goal of the Christian life. So when we hear James say that religion is pure and undefiled before God, to care for orphans and widows in distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world, we have to reframe what he meant by pure, undefiled, and unstained. He wasn't worried about contaminated religion, inerrant worship, blemished faith. He was challenging the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem to worship with integrity, to have a religion that does not divide faith and work or separate hearing from doing. A religion of integrity that not only hears the words and has faith, but puts that faith into action by doing the work of caring for those who are most vulnerable in times of distress. James's call to real worship was no different than the Jewish prophets who came before him, like Hosea, who said, "I desire acts of mercy, not just sacrifice." Or Isaiah, who said, "I cannot endure your solemn assemblies with iniquity. Your new moons and your appointed festivals my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen." Because real worship, he says, is not just speaking ceremonial words or praying nice prayers, but doing good, seeking justice, rescuing the oppressed, defending the orphan, and pleading for the widow. Why was James so concerned with integrity? I imagine it was because his community was in the midst of a crisis. And it is when the storms and the hurricanes of life hit that you find out what people are really made of and who they really are by what they do. 17 years ago, on September 11th, when terrorists bombed the World Trade Center, we saw the true face of first responders in New York City, as brave and selfless police officers, firefighters, and EMTs risked their lives and even gave their lives to save the lives of others. And the same has been true right here in North Carolina over the last few weeks, in places like Wilmington, New Bern, Lumberton, and Fayetteville, where police and firefighters and EMTs and ordinary citizens battled storm surge and waded through dangerous waters, braved fierce winds and falling trees and downed power lines to save the lives of people who were stranded and trapped by Hurricane Florence. When you're in the midst of a crisis, that is when we see people act selflessly and courageously for others. That is when we see true integrity coming together. If we're honest, though, when we see the first responders in action, we sometimes think, that's great, but isn't that what they're supposed to do? Isn't that what they're paid to do? Don't police officers get paid to protect and serve? Aren't firefighters and EMTs paid to respond to emergencies? Isn't that what they all signed up for? And the answer is yes. But James would argue that the same concept applies to the followers of Jesus. We all signed up for this, to follow Jesus, who came saying, I'm coming to bring peace and good news to the poor, to proclaim the release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. So when we hear about orphans and widows or anyone vulnerable or oppressed, it is not enough simply to hear their cries and pray. We must act in love. According to James, doing nothing betrays our identity and makes us hypocrites who are alienated and divided from our true selves. There's the brilliant award-winning film you may have seen, 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. And in this film, a woman named Mildred Hayes puts up 3 billboards in her town to protest the local police department's lack of interest in solving the murder of her teenage daughter, Angela. The town becomes furious and enraged with Mildred because the billboards place the blame on their beloved sheriff, Chief Willoughby. And there is a powerful scene, many powerful scenes in this movie, but one in particular where Mildred comes home to find a priest from the local church in town waiting for her at the kitchen table with her son. And the priest says to Mildred, now Mildred, I'm here to talk to you about what you've been doing in town. I need you to know everybody is with you about Angela, but nobody is with you about these billboards. James would be furious with this priest. How dare you, he would say. You are the epitome of this town's indifference. A woman in your community lost a child in a brutal act of violence, and all you can offer her are your words, your thoughts and prayers. You and this town claim to be with Mildred, but you won't do anything with her to support her in her efforts to draw attention to her daughter's case. You are only with her in word and not in deed, which means you are not really with her at all. Your actions tell another story. They betray your deep hypocrisy. The opposite of integrity for James is duplicity or duplicitousness. He even had a great, unique Greek word that he used throughout the letter to refer to those who were struggling with their integrity. He calls them disaikos, which literally means double-minded. James accused people not only within his own community, but those who were persecuting them of saying one thing and doing another, setting up a series of dualisms and binaries that divided people from one another and God and split their Christian identity in two. Sometimes James describes this duality as a double tongue, gossiping or speaking out of both sides of your mouth. Other times, James described it as a series of false dichotomies between faith and works, hearing and doing, word and deed, belief and practice, prayer and action, worship and caring for the poor, as if those things are somehow separate. These dualisms, James warned, compel people to another greater duplicity. The duplicity of showing partiality, playing favorites, pitting one group against another, elevating some people above others, and prioritizing the rich before the poor. Engaging, he says, in the dualism of discrimination. As you know, James had strong words for duplicitous and double-minded behavior. He calls the disaikos two-faced people who are not just victims of dual thinking, but are also practicing a dualistic kind of living, literally leading a double life and suffering with divided hearts that are wavering and inconstant, ambiguous and fickle, unstable and highly destructive to the health and well-being of the community. A serious lack of integrity in his community is the only way to explain why James would feel it necessary to counsel the people. If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what good is that? Words without deeds are hollow. If what is really needed is a true act of intervention on behalf of those who are struggling, then words without action are nothing but lip service. A lot of what goes for religion these days is just lip service, suffering from a serious lack of integrity, often resulting from this dualistic mentality, a binary or either-or thinking that has led to what Richard Rohr calls fast food religion. The church has always been accused of this kind of thing, this kind of hypocrisy for many, many generations, of saying one thing and doing another, saying we follow Jesus and then looking nothing like him, saying we believe in love but acting out in hate. But no church and no Christian is perfect, because the church is made up of finite human beings on a journey of faith who often miss the mark. And that is why we come to this place and have confession every Sunday, because we always need to be called back to a deeper integrity of word and deed, to a firmer consistency in our hearing and our doing. The purpose of confession and of all genuine and authentic worship is to create the conditions of an encounter with a divine mystery of infinite grace, an encounter so powerful it will be like looking in a mirror to see all the inconsistencies in our lives and discover the places that we are being invited to be woven back together with God and others into an integrated whole. But even our beloved church here has this difficulty, I think, living up to our highest ideals. We've written a lot of extraordinary words about ourselves, an incredible covenant, an ambitious strategic plan, a beautiful theology of worship. We proclaim to be priests to one another, ministers of reconciliation, bold in spirit, open to all. The definition of integrity, remember, is doing what you say. Are we doing the things that we've said we were going to do? Are we being true to the ideals that we have written down and committed to? Are we hearing and doing, or just hearing? What would it mean for us to seek a deeper kind of integration between the values we've espoused and the life we lead together? What does integrity look like and feel like? 3 days after the attacks of 9/11, with our nation suffering in deep grief and seething in anger and desperately in need of healing, a bipartisan group of advantageous politicians brought a resolution known as the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which would give the president authority to unilaterally use military force from that moment on and forever if a connection could be made to 9/11. It set the stage for perpetual war on terror, which has been raging now in Afghanistan and Iraq for 15 years and more, the two longest wars in American history. Every person in both houses of Congress voted for the bill, all except for one, a woman named Barbara Lee. Given the political pressure at the time, Lee also was preparing to vote for the resolution until she attended a prayer service at the National Cathedral, where Reverend Nathan Baxter offered a prayer for the nation, in which he ended by saying, "And as we come to respond to these acts of violence that have fallen upon us, let us not become the evil we deplore." At that moment, Lee said, she knew there was no way that her faith or her conscience would allow her to vote for the resolution. And so she stood and gave a speech, a powerful speech on the House floor. And as she spoke, she wept for the nation and then voted against the resolution. For her action, she was called a traitor. She and her family received countless death threats and hate mail for months, for years. She was a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, standing against the empire. but her faith required her to act. And so that's what she did. Consistency in faith and work and worship and life, hearing and doing, belief and prayer, practice and action, word and deed is what Jesus offered us when he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself. The love we are called to is not a love that separates word and deed, or heart and soul, or mind and body. It is not a love that divides worship from compassion or separates our relationship with God from our relationship with our neighbors. It is a united love, a whole and integrated love. And so as we embark on this journey of awakening the body together this year, let us ask ourselves, are our bodies doing what our mouths have said? Are we living out the values that we believe? If not, then let us seek to find the courage and the strength to put ourselves back together, to reunite our hearing and our doing, to reunite our spirits with our flesh and our bones, to reunite our worship in this space with our worship out there in the world. That is real worship, holistic, integral, and embodied. And there is great power in real worship. It has the power to free us from double-mindedness and duplicity, the power to liberate us from the double lives that we often lead, the power not only to overcome all the dualisms that plague our lives, but the power to reconcile us with God, the power to reknit entire communities back together, the power even to reunite the world. Amen.